Morning.
Good morning, everybody. This is Monday Morning Talmud with Congregation Beth Shalom and Kilat HaKerem. It's getting a longer name as we go on. The weather here in Pittsburgh is muggy and hot. It's supposed to be 92 degrees, which is not ideal. What's the weather supposed to be like in Carmiel?
Well, it's 35, 36, 37. It's hot.
Yeah,
That's outside my
Celsius
house,
report.
it's 39, which is 102.
That is so hot. That sounds awful.
Wow.
Stay inside and study Talmud. That's what I
No.
propose.
And they said this week is going to be really extremely hot.
Good. Rent a fan.
Every week they say, this week is very hot, and then it will break. And then the next week comes and this week will be very hot, and then it will.
This is
not
especially hot.
Gotcha.
It's not breaking.
But the Carmiel people, I just read a local report. Apparently there was a man with a machete running mad on the road near, they saw it with Gilon, tried to break into a car and attack somebody. And people from the train saw him and called the police.
Oh,
Wow.
wow.
Yeah, early this morning. Somebody from Carmiel.
Well, that's terrible.
Oh, hi.
Yeah.
Stay away from
I don't know any more details.
Stay away
There are
from
crazy
people with
people
machetes.
everywhere.
All right, let's get to some Talmud.
Yeah, much
Follow
more
us on. We don't have
interesting.
that much time.
Indeed.
This morning, for those of you who want to know, in the room we have and we have Paula. And we have my giant set of the Talmud. And we have that's Rabbi Lehman, and there's another guy over there we're not going to talk about. Okay. So
Okay.
well, there's a bunch of other guys on these walls, but there's not a
On
lot.
the walls.
There's some.
Okay.
I finally found one of the things I've been thinking about is the art in the building is long on Orthodox-looking men, and then I just found, I didn't realize this, there is a hallway with a number of women, depictions of women doing Jewish things. It's only like 2 or 3 pictures, but downstairs, no, there's a girl getting a bat mitzvah and stuff like that. I think it is in the hallway on the 2nd floor. No, 3rd floor.
Can't get there.
I'll have to show you, but
Can't get there.
let's do some Talmud. We are gonna be picking it up in the very end of page 33a, I think, but right before it flips to 33b, if I'm not mistaken. We did this the other day, so we're not gonna do that. We're gonna start in the middle of the page. And actually this piece that we did right here, line 3, we did a few weeks ago, but or months ago, but we're gonna kind of just start there as our refresher. So with that, I'm gonna pick it up with Elisheva reading first, if it's okay by you, Elisheva. Right, I have to read the Hebrew. V'hashomea min ha'mitasek lo yatsa, aval hashomea min ha'mashmi'a la'atzmo. Mai yatsa lema tehave tiyuvte de Rav Zera de Amar le Rebbe Zera le sham'e ikavein utaka li.
The Mishnah continues, and one who hears the shofar blasts from one who acts unawares has not fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara asks, however, one who hears the shofar blast from one who is sounding the shofar for himself without intention of sounding it for others, what is the halacha? The Mishnah apparently indicates that he has fulfilled his obligation. Let us say that this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rabbi Zera, as Rabbi Zera said to his attendant, have the intention to sound the shofar on my behalf and sound it for me. This statement indicates that one must have the intention to enable the one who hears it to fulfill his obligation.
Okay, so it's a very weird problem. It has like really one practical application in Jewish law, potentially. And the weird law that we're dealing with is the question of, can one fulfill an obligation for another person without fulfilling an obligation for themselves, right? Can I blow shofar for Paula while thinking to myself, this is not fulfilling my obligation? Now, why would a person do that? For shofar, there's like one possible reason, which has more application than the rest of the year regarding tefillah, which is, let's say I get up, and this applies. I can think of a great example here at Beth Shalom. We have a early morning service on Shabbat, and sometimes the early morning service on Yom Tov. And one of the critical questions in brachot of, let's say a person goes to the 6:30 minyan and then comes back for the 9:30 minyan. Right. Let's say D was leading services, okay? And let's say D led the service at 6:30. And let's say she walks in at 9:30 and they say, D, there's nobody here who knows how to lead. Can you lead at 9:30, right? The logical answer very simply might be, well, yes, because nobody else can lead. But the problem, as announced by this line in the Mishnah, is if D has already fulfilled her obligation in the morning, she can't do it twice, right? She can't do the 9:30 minyan because it would fulfill her obligation again, which has already gone away. So can she fulfill an obligation for other people without fulfilling the obligation for herself, right? The Mishnah here is inconclusive in the sense that it's not inconclusive. There are two opinions, right? One who hears the shofar blast from one who acts unawares has not fulfilled their obligation. Meaning if a person is not attempting to fulfill their own obligation, they cannot fulfill other people's obligations. That's the first line. Now it's talking about shofar, but the idea is a mitzvah that one person fulfills for another person. If that's the logic, then you can't do it for tefillah either. However, one who hears shofar blast from one who is sounding the shofar for himself without intention of sounding for others, right? I'm davening in Lehman as loud as possible, and over in Homestead, which is down the hallway. For you and Carmiel, now that I've been to Carmiel, you have to, if you've never been to Pittsburgh and you've never seen our building, you have to have some appreciation of the fact that this building is ridiculous and cavernous and has rooms upon rooms. And it took me 3 or 4 years and at least a year of working here before I found the vast majority of the rooms. There are still, I think, a couple rooms I've never been to and never seen. I've never been to the 5th floor. And there is an archive room off the 4th floor that I've also never seen. And there's a hallway down the 4th floor that I've also never been through, right? I work here.
I have been there once, by the way.
So,
it's humongous.
yeah. So, but anyways, imagine that I was in the vestibule at Carmiel, at the synagogue in Carmiel, and someone else was in the social hall. Can the person praying by themselves in the vestibule loudly enough fulfill unintentionally the obligation of the people praying in the social hall? So that's the paradigm that's being thrown out here.
How do you know that things are being intentional or not intentional?
Right. So we talked about that briefly last time, which is knowing, and this is where this all logically breaks down, knowing the intention of the person 2 rooms away for whom you are trying to fulfill your intention is a huge problem, right? So that's why this second one kind of makes sense, right? One who hears the shofar blast from one who's sounding it for himself has fulfilled their obligation, because you can't really know whether that person is davening for themselves or whether they don't mind discharging the obligation of other people. Go ahead, Paula.
Should be able to do it for a second time, because that's a mitzvah. Even if you did yours earlier, the people waiting and needed it done, if you're doing it a second time, you're doing a mitzvah for them, so it should be fine.
Right, and I think that is maybe the way you would.
Can you repeat what Paula said? Because we can't hear.
We
Paula
can't
said
hear.
that she would think that the logic would hold that one who tries to discharge the obligation of another person, even one who has already discharged their own obligation, can do so because it is a mitzvah. The paradigm that I put forth at first of D, who has fulfilled the obligation at the 6:30 minyan and is the only person who could do the 9:30 minyan, would seem to be logical to hold true. The Mishnah at the beginning implies that you can't do that, but you could make the argument, which the Talmud would very likely do, that case and the case that I brought are not identical, because there's a difference between one who hears a shofar blast from one who acts unaware, and a person who is aware and has filled the obligation but wants to fulfill it again for other people, right? Yeah, okay. let us say this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rabbi Zera, as Rabbi Zera said to his attendant, have the intent to sound the shofar on my behalf and sound it for me. So Rabbi Zera had someone else who he assigned the obligation of discharging his own obligation. And that would be implied as not something that could not be done, because it's laid out here as as being a refutation of the other thing. Rashi's explanation of why that is the case is because you have to have your own intention in order to enable someone else who hears it to fulfill their obligation. All right. The last line kind of finishes. Go ahead, Marion.
Yeah, the translation unawares. I think that's, I don't like that. Because in the English, it says, in the Hebrew, it says for himself. It doesn't say unawares.
Yeah, I think they're trying to clarify it within the logic of the text. So I don't know, but maybe you're right. Maybe it works better without the word unawares.
Well, somebody who isn't Jewish blows a shofar.
Dee asked if a person who wasn't Jewish could blow the shofar. Typically, in all halachic literature, a non-Jew can't fulfill any mitzvot. All the more so, a non-Jew can't fulfill mitzvot. We mentioned this last time. The person who plays the organ and sings Shema at services, like the choir you were bringing up last time, and the answer is non-Jewish. An entirely non-Jewish choir could not fulfill the obligation. But you're getting into the issue of whether a choir's real purpose is discharging obligations or whether it's more about elevating. And that's partially why Shliach Tzibor is often saying a whole bunch of Hebrew, and then the choir will pause. The Shliach Tzibor will pause, and the choir will jump in and sing something nice.
He would only have a male choir.
Right. Moshe, Rabbi Cantor Moshe Taube is being pointed at, and he had some rules. Anyways, let's do this last line before we move on to the more interesting part. Noreen, you're going to read the English. Dilma ade ditana resha mit asek tana seifa nami mit asek.
The Gemara rejects this argument. Perhaps one can explain that since the first clause of the Mishnah taught the halacha with regard to one who acts unawares, the latter clause also taught the halacha with regard to one who acts unawares. Okay? If so, no inference must be drawn from here to the case of one who sounds the shofar for himself with no intention of doing so for others.
Good. This is a complicated piece of logic, which either you kind of get it, or you kind of don't. Which is basically it's a version of the example that I threw out with D, which is one could pick apart these two things and say that Rabbi Zera's opinion is not invalid because it applies in a different case, because one is a case of acting awares and one is a case of acting unaware. So Marion, we were dealing with the idea up above without questioning presence of mind, right? Whether the individuals involved have presence of mind or not. So I don't know. I mean, I think what we end on here is we're still dealing with a really doubtful case of whether a person who is not sure whether they're fulfilling obligations, who has no intention of fulfilling obligations for other people, or who has no obligation of fulfilling for themselves, whether another person can fulfill those obligations. And the central principle then becomes whether that person had the intent to fulfill it for another person or not, which gets back really to Dee and Paula's question originally of how do we know whether the other person had intent for us or not? And that's why the logic is interesting here to try and separate out, but the practical application of this is basically null and void. All right, with that, let's get into something a little bit easier and a little bit more practical. And that is finally, at long last, 1.5 pages before the end of the Talmud. Hey, how do we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, right? I think it's stunning that you go 33.5 pages into the Talmud or 32.5 pages into the Talmud, and they don't even cover what a tekiah, a shavarim, and a teruah are. So let's start with this. We'll do the Mishnah. Renee was going to talk, but she has disappeared. So Marion, you're going to get this turn. we're in a new Mishnah. This is not, I don't think it's the last Mishnah in our Talmud. Let me check. But it's pretty close. Remember, they each parak introduces a bunch of ideas from the Mishnah and then kind of sallies forth. Oh my God! It is the last Mishnah. This is the last Mishnah. There's a non-zero chance that we'll finish the Talmud before Rosh Hashanah.
All right, so we're gonna have a cocktail party?
Another
We
one.
have to have a party.
We had one.
Definitely.
We had an official one. We can now have an unofficial one for actually officially finishing. So because I cheated. I mean, we all know I cheated, which is that like we were close enough to the end of the Masechet that I was like, listen, if I can help people to not fast, I'll daven it up really fast and say that we finished. But nobody, even me, didn't fully understand the entire tractate of Gemara. So but it's good stuff. Okay, with that, let's do this one. Matnitin, our Mishnah, Seder Tikiyot, Shalosh, Shel Shalosh, Shalosh. Shior Tikiyah, Keshalosh Truot, Shior Truah, Keshalosh Yevavot. Taka Barishona, Umashach Beshniya, Kishtaim, Ein Beyado Ela Achat.
Mishnah. The order of the blast is 3 sets of 3 blasts each, which are Tekiah, Truah, and Tekiah. The length of the Tekiah is equal to the length of 3 Truot, and the length of the Truah is equal to the length, the length of the Truah is equal to the length of 3 whimpers. As one sounded the first Tekiah of the initial series of Tekiah, Truah, Tekiah, and then extended the second Tekiah of that series to the length of 2 Tekiyot, so that it should count as both the second Tekiah of the first set and the first Tekiah of the second set, he has in his hand the fulfillment of only 1 Tekiah, and he must begin the second set with a new Tekiah.
Okay. This feels confusing, and the back end is a little bit confusing. And of course, this is a Mishnah. So of course, the Talmud is going to pull this apart a little bit more. So you don't have to fully comprehend it right now. But the first and most important thing to ascertain is this. We're not really talking about what the notes are. We're talking about the length of the notes. And because all of us actually know how the shofar service goes, this actually isn't going to be that complicated for us. So unfortunately, I didn't bring my shofar today. I will bring, you want to grab me one? Yeah, go grab me one. But I'll start by explaining it without a shofar, and then we'll see if I can blow somebody else's shofar randomly without any trouble. So
Does it have germs?
I'm not worried. I don't care. I'm quadruple vaxxed and I've already had COVID. And also, if I got it now, that'd be a relief because then I'd be done with it by the time we got to the high holidays. So, yeah, no, this is when you're youngish and healthy. This is the way you treat it. You know, I am indestructible once again, like I was 23 years old. So we're not talking about the blasts themselves. They seem to have an assumption that we kind of know what the blasts are, which is interesting. Yeah. Even though, as I recall, I don't believe that was ever mentioned. And we're only dealing with 2 types of notes. We're only dealing with Tekiah and Teruah. Okay, so Tekiah, for those who remember, is the 1 last long blast, and Teruah is the 9 blast. Da, 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 da. Okay, and what they're saying here is, and this is the important part, the note that the type of note that you're playing, whether it's a whole note or a half note, is the same for the 2 sets, meaning or a better way of saying that if I were a musician is to say the number of bars that you play the note for is the same between Tekiah and Teruah. So Tekiah should go, and Teruah should go, and the length between the 2 should be the same. All right, so let me find one with a decent umbrature. This one is the best one, I think. So let's see if I can get this one going. It's a cheap one. It's a little one. And it's been a while since I blew. And there's no blessing during the month of Elul. So let's see if I can get this guy going. So not bad, but I could do better. No, it's fine. No. It's really hard when you get a new umbrature. You have to like kind of redo your lips in a totally different way. I'm having a real hard time with this one, guys. There we go.
Forget it. Okay, we're anything.
So that's what it has to be, right? The one note and the 9 notes have to be roughly the same length of time. So that's what they're talking about when they say shiur. The measure of the tekiah is like shalosh taruot, which is a little confusing because a teruah, as we know, is 9 notes. So when they say the shiur of a tekiah is like 3 taruot, maybe we're talking about but that's probably not it, because we don't do, because that would be 27 notes, right? And the length, how could you possibly bust out 27 notes at the same length of one tekiah? So it probably doesn't mean that. They must be talking about a teruah as maybe, I think the logic here would be that a teruah is 3 notes. And a teruah is 1/3 the length of a tekiah. Now, the problem with that is what we call a 3-note blast that is equal in length to a tekiah. What we call that is, we call it a shivarim. Okay, so that's a little bit strange, but we all know that a shivarim sounds the same length as a tekiah. All right, we have 2 questions up on the board, Noreen and then Olivia.
I have I think, a hypothetical question. What happens if the shofar blower in the middle cannot continue, just hasn't got the strength to keep on blowing, or some such thing? What would happen?
So we're going to get to something a little bit later, which deals with the thing that was
Okay.
mentioned about a paragraph of, it's not really going to answer your question, but it's the best I can do, which is a mention that the person who does musaf also blows shofar. And the implication there is, now what I know from backwards is that almost never happens anymore. The person who, at least in a conservative or a reform synagogue, the person who blows shofar is almost never the person who does musaf, right? So the logic there would imply that in the modern era, what we do in the Talmud regarding making sure that one person does the thing is no longer applies, right? We no longer worry about that. So that would be my guess. All right, Olivia, go ahead.
We couldn't really hear the shofar through Zoom. Could
Really?
you turn on your original sound?
Wait, why couldn't you hear the shofar? And what's your suggestion for how to fix it?
Zoom thinks it's trash noise that should be muted.
Weird.
And
Yeah, we
mutes
couldn't hear it at all.
Weird.
So
That's
up
weird.
near the top left where it says recording, there should
Yeah.
also be a button that says original sound.
By recording. So I have to let me come out of stop share because that might help. By recording, it
So-
says, where do you think that is?
Directly to the right. So, okay, so recording is in the top left.
It is not.
Mm.
Oh, that button. Yes. Okay.
And then you see original sound, off.
I don't have an original sound button. It just says recording and then there's a pause and a stop.
Okay. Let's go to where your mute button is, and then that little up arrow next to your mute button.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh,
And then
yeah.
settings.
Audio settings?
What's it called for you? Yeah, audio settings. It's the bottom.
Okay.
Unless you have original sound there.
Suppress background noise, auto. Should I?
Yeah, so you can turn
Auto-
that.
I could turn it to low. I'll turn it to medium. Computer fan, pen taps, typing, dog barks. All right, we'll turn it to high.
And then
We'll turn it to medium. We'll see how that works. All right, we'll see what happens. Can you hear this?
right under that is also original sound.
Go down, it says show in meeting option to enable original sound.
Oh, there we go.
Right there.
Okay. Original sound off. Original sound on. Problem solved. All right. Let's see if that works. Does it sound different already?
No,
No, nothing sounds different. All right, let's hear it. That's crazy, by the way, that Zoom muted the shofar. I bet you all over America there are people who are experiencing this. And that is
Yeah, it's anti-Semitic.
Yeah, yeah,
that's
it's
really
not,
interesting. For Morning Minion, we actually have to find this out.
I guess none of us, I didn't hear it either.
Maddie says
We have
Zoom does not
Morning
support our
Minion
LOL
on
obligation.
Zoom. And the guy who blows the shofar, we can hear it, but it's very faint.
Okay, let's see if you can hear
I
it.
wonder
now.
if it's
What?
faint.
but he's on Zoom. He's
Oh,
not.
wait, we might think this is a digression, but this might be the most important digression in the history of Judaism because we are dealing with the question of can one fulfill the obligation of shofar? Can you discharge the obligation if you are unawares? And literally, we just had this situation where, like, I blew the shofar. The two people in the room were like, yeah, we heard the shofar. And everyone else was like, hey, Rabbi, are you going to blow the shofar? And the answer was, everybody was like gaslit. They were all like, he didn't blow the shofar. He's just messing with us. I really blew a shofar. They knew it. All right.
We were aware.
Now let's see if original sound works. Let's find out. I'm still not doing very good with this shofar.
Yes, yes,
Yeah, but
yes.
we can hear it.
They might not want to.
All right. So at least we got a sound out.
Yeah.
You could hear it online. But you heard that the length of time I spent blowing for the first note, for the 3 notes, and for the 9 notes was supposed to be the same. But right now we're still in an unclear situation where we're not sure whether the word teruah here, which very strongly seems to imply it's a 3-note blast, which is not our teruah. But I'll continue. Let's keep going and deal with the other thing that happened, which is it mentions shalosh, shalosh, right? So a 3 that is a 3 of 3. And Rashi helps us there by saying it is tekiah, shivari, or tekiah, teruah, tekiah, tekiah, teruah, tekiah, tekiah, teruah, tekiah. So it's 3 sets. And that doesn't necessarily tell us. So the shalosh doesn't tell us how many blasts we're dealing with. It deals with how many sets of blasts we're dealing with. So 3 of a tekiah, 3 of a teruah, and 3 of a tekiah, but not in that order. 3 of a
All right,
tekiah.
now I'm not seeing the text.
Right. I don't know why that is.
Oh, all right.
You may have turned it off.
It's me.
It's just you. Okay. So tinker around.
Is it just me?
It is just you.
Yeah.
Yeah, got it.
All right. All right, let's keep going. So the back end is like if you do the first set of tekiot in the initial series of tekiah, teruah, tekiah, and then extended the second tekiah of the series to the length of 2 tekiot, so it should count as both the second tekiah of the first set and the first tekiah of the second set. He has only 1 tekiah. So what are we dealing with? It's this. I'm going to get it. Trust me. I'm going to get a good blow of this. So if there's no real clear difference between the end of your first tekiah and the beginning of your second set of tekiot, maybe it doesn't count. That's what they're implying. So it's this. Let's see if we can get another blast again. Right? I did 1 real tekiah between the 2 shivarims. And what I should have done is stopped and made a break. And the question is, does it count or did I screw it up and do I have to go back?
It counts because your face and neck got red.
I did get very red. This is a harder
Well,
shofar to
as red as
blow
we've seen already.
than mine. I'm much more comfortable. My own shofar is easier to blow than this little sucker, but I'm
The
getting...
smaller the shofar, the harder it is to blow.
Yeah, this one's a little small.
Oh, really?
The really big ones are the easiest.
Yeah,
Huh.
but the really big ones, I was about to say something totally inappropriate, and I have to remember not to get in trouble. The real you'll have to imagine. I'll say it in a proper way.
Close the doors.
No, right?
Oh,
That's
don't
totally
say
bad.
it.
If you've,
Mark,
I will.
don't say it.
No, I'll say it in a proper way. If you've ever smoked a nargila, right? If you really are sucking on the thing like it's like, like no tomorrow, it doesn't really work. It's too much. But if you just very mellowly, like kind of like inhale calmly and slowly, then it works just fine. That's what the long kudu horns are like. That if you blow them at a very mellow, kind of low way, it resonates nicely and it works. This one's the opposite. You have to force a lot of air through it in order to get a blast. All right, let's keep going. We're still in the Mishnah. Judy, I did not impugn my good reputation in any way, right? I have not broken any laws, or I have not admitted
It isn't laws.
any breaking
It's
of
the
law.
woke culture.
It's the woke culture.
It's not law. It's not laws.
The woke culture is okay with the fact that I have smoked from a nargila, I believe. I don't smoke anymore. I never smoke anymore because it's bad for you. And I also rather run.
Ask what you smoked.
I will not answer those questions.
Probably not what I smoked.
All right, here we go, Judy. You're going to read line 6 in the
I
English.
can't. I'm
Oh, you
not
can't.
getting, I don't know what the problem is here.
All right, my advice would be to go out and go back in, and it'll all.
Oh, all right. Okay. All
All right.
right.
With that, Olivia, if you don't mind, if you will read for us, we would appreciate it. Mi sheberach v'achar kach nimna lo shofar tokea umeria v'tokea shalosh pe'amim.
With regard to one who recited the blessings of the additional prayer, and only afterward a shofar became available to him, he sounds a tekiah, sounds a teruah, and sounds a tekiah. And order, he repeats 3 times.
Okay, so this one's really confusing, and hopefully they'll explain it to us down in the Talmud. But you recite the blessings of Musaf, right? You do Musaf, and afterward you get a shofar. It says Tokea umaria v'tokea. And it's interesting, there's a verb for truah that I never knew existed, which is Maria, right? It's the active hif'il of tekiah, right? You cause to of teruah. You cause to teruah would be another way of saying that. And the implication is that you do tekiah, teruah, tekiah 3 times, which means you do the set that we read up above. Okay. We are also very likely, because we're dealing with the Mishnah, we're dealing with the person who recites the Musaf. It's implied up above in one place by Rashi, but not here in Steinsaltz, interestingly, that we are again not talking about the shofar service that we do right after the Torah service, but rather we're talking about the blowing of shofar in Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. Okay, so if you're wondering what sets are we dealing with, we're dealing with the set that happens in Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. Okay, and the reason, of course, logically here is if you don't have a shofar and you're doing Musaf, then Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot really apply, because the implication here is you would have done Malchuyot, done Zichronot, and done Shofarot. And then Chaim Yankel walks into the synagogue and says, hey, does anybody happen to need a shofar? And you're like, we're done with Musaf, but we will do it anyways, right? This is akin to not making minyan at the beginning of services. And in the case of one who does not make minyan at the beginning of services, and you've done Baruch, and you would have done Baruch Hu, but you didn't have 10, there are a couple places at which you should do it. The most traditional place to do it, I believe, is right before Aleinu, which I find
That's when
odd,
we do it.
but it's what we do. Okay, with that, let's keep going in the Mishnah. And with that, I will have Renee read. Kishem sheshaliach tzibor chayav, kach kol yachid v'yachid chayav. Rabban Gamliel omer, shaliach tzibor motzi et hadvarim yedei, et harabim yedei chovatan. Excuse me.
Just as the prayer leader is obligated the prayer of Rosh Hashanah, so too each and every individual is obligated in these prayers. Rabbi Gamliel disagrees and says individuals are not obligated as the prayer leader fulfills the obligation on behalf of the many.
Great. So in context, we would assume that we're still talking about Musaf, but it's possible we're talking about all of the tefillot of Rosh Hashanah. And again, this is kind of odd that it appears here because we've changed subjects suddenly and with no like real explanation. Additionally, remember, this is the last line in all of the Mishnah of Rosh Hashanah, right? And it kind of goes backward into a place that doesn't wrap up our Mishnayot particularly well. So it'll be really interesting to see what the Gemara does with this. Gemara tends to, especially at the end of a tractate of Talmud, become a dumping ground, meaning they'll just throw in all sorts of random stuff that they need to get off their chests before they're done with the tractate, right? So whether they'll deal with this issue or not, I don't know. It's kind of really interesting. They may deal with this issue and then move on to something completely off topic because they get fairly untopical at the end of every parak. The end of every parak that ends the entire Gemara, they'll get really untopical. So anyways, just for those who didn't quite pick up what we're talking about, every person has to say the Amidah for this holiday, right? And the Musaf Amidah for this holiday. Wandering into services just for the repetition doesn't fulfill your obligation according to the Mishnah. Now, Rabban Gamliel says that's not true. The prayer leader discharges everyone's obligation, meaning you could wander in late, or you could do what's referred to as a Hecher Kedusha, and you are okay. Now, Hecher Kedusha is an idea that the conservative movement kind of invented, because back in the day, they probably didn't do a Hecher Kedusha at all. Hecher Kedusha, for those who are not aware, is this idea of doing the first three blessings together as a community and then going silent. But there is mention of the leader discharging everyone's obligation without you doing the individual Amidah on your own. Elisheva, you have your hand up. Go ahead. And then Paula.
I think I know the answer, but it's still confusing. If the shaliach is fulfilling everybody's obligation under the circumstance where not everybody can read or say it or have good intention, fine. But how does the shaliach fulfill other people's obligation if those other people, in this case, don't have an obligation? That does not make sense to me.
Who doesn't have the obligation in this case that you're
Everybody else in the shul. That's how I'm reading this.
Why don't they have an obligation?
Prayer leader fulfills the obligation on behalf of the many, and Steinsaltz adds in individuals, therefore, are not obligated. But if we're not obligated, what's the shaliach fulfilling for?
I don't think he means that as individuals have no individual obligation. My understanding of what Steinsaltz is saying there is individuals are not obligated personally, right? You're not personally obligated to it, parenthesis, if the Shaliach Tzibor discharges your obligation. Everyone is obligated to say that, but the question is, do you have to say it yourself or can someone say it on your behalf? It's the same principle in Jewish law as, do I have to say Hamotzi Lecha Min Haaretz at
What can I just say? Amen.
Kiddush, if Rabbi Adelson has already said Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz, or have I discharged my obligation?
Provided you say amen to it.
Right, exactly. If I say amen, I've discharged it. All right, Paul has a question, and then Marion.
Okay.
I'm sitting at home and I have absolutely no intention of going to shul to do this, which is worse than coming in late. I haven't fulfilled anything because he can't fulfill it for me because I'm not planning on being there.
You're talking about on Zoom.
No, just in general. I'm not going to go.
If you're not right, so Paul is asking the question: can one fulfill the obligation for another if they're not present? The answer is
they have
no.
intentions of going.
The answer is no. About 10 pages ago in the Talmud, you can't fulfill obligations unless a person is present. And the debate that they get into is the question of presence.
Coming in late, you weren't present for it, so it shouldn't be able to be fulfilled.
if you come in during the
For the
repetition.
repetition.
Right. So Dee and Paul are arguing about whether you come in for the repetition or not. The repetition fulfills your obligation as long as you're there for
As long as you're there in person.
parenthetically all of it, right? That's kind of
So people
hypothetically
come
what we're
in
dealing with.
Really late because they just want to eat after everything or fulfill.
Right. Now, in the
And then they
modern
get filmed.
in the modern world, this gets into like, I mean, hypothetically, one is obligated in over 1,000 Amidas a year, right? 3 times a day, actually 4 on Shabbat. So it's like well into like the 1,200 amount of Amidot. And according to I don't know, I think it's the 4th parak of Brachot, if you miss an Amidah, you're supposed to say a Tashlumim. You're supposed to say a makeup Amidah for the one before. But nobody in the modern world really does that, not even in the Orthodox world, right? If you miss an Amidah, you miss an Amidah, right? And you carry on. So we kind of understand that like the fulfilling of an obligation is good. This area for, I think, conservative rabbis is going to fall into the category of, can I fulfill the obligation for everyone else, knowing that they're not going to want to, or they're going to wander in at 11 o'clock for the service that began at 9, right? Like, is that going to be good enough? And more importantly, can I cut the silent Amidah in if I need to in order to do just a community Amidah? We have a cantor in Erie, and telling the cantor you're not going to do a full repetition is just not going to fly. So we're just going to lump along with it, and hopefully it'll work. But that reminds me, I really have to sit down and edit the service outline on my day off tomorrow. I don't want to work on my day off. Okay, anyways, this is what happens when you have 2 jobs. Marion, you had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. First of all, I was curious about the fact that during the discussion of the shofar blowing, it mentions Tikiyah and Truah. It doesn't say anything about Shvarim.
Yeah. I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know. We could read this a couple ways. One is the Mishnah up above with the 3 of 3. We could read it, but I don't think it's the right way to read it. That at some point we are talking about Tikiyah, Shavarim, and Teruah. But the way that we're understanding really the 3 of 3 is that we're talking about sets and not the individual notes of each thing, which is consistent with something we saw earlier. So right now we only know about Tikiyah and Teruah, and we're not entirely sure whether Tikiyah and Teruah are the Tikiyah and the Teruah that we know of today. I think the Gemara is going to address this, but I'm relying on a faulty remembrance from like a decade ago. So go ahead, Olivia.
All right, I had a second.
Oh,
thing,
Marion has a follow-up question. Go
that
ahead.
the repetition of the Amidah by the Shliach Tzibor, isn't it meant also from people who are unable to do the Amidah by themselves for physical, mental reasons, what have you?
And also because scrolls were expensive, and the assumption was, now we were an oral culture in Talmud times, and so the assumption I think back then would be, of course you don't own a Siddur, you would have gone to Cheder and you would have memorized this, and you will say it. But the problem with memorization is people have faulty memories and they make mistakes, even when you learn by rote back in the day. So that's why you have a Shliach Tzibor, that's a person who is better at memorizing it and reciting it properly, or a person who has the text in front of them. So that would have been probably the main reason. Less so about literacy and ability, and more so about... Now, I think, by the way, that's a pietistic and very positive look on the people of the past, that all of our children went to Cheder and all of them memorized the Amidah. I don't think that's so. I think that there was a vast large number of Jews who were probably just as non-observant back then in Talmudic times as are people today.
Or were poor and they couldn't.
To get an education, right? And so there was always a need for the Shliach Tzibor to discharge the obligation. So I think that Rabban Gamliel's take is right. The fact that the stam of the Mishnah, which is usually the decisive opinion that we hold by, says everyone's obligated, is really, really strict and really, really unrealistic, both in modern times and even in Talmudic times, I think. But we'll see if the Talmud gets into that. The Talmud often doesn't deal with practical issues like Not everybody has a text. Not everybody knows how to memorize stuff. Sometimes it does, but not always. All right, Olivia, go ahead.
When it says each and every yichid ve'yichid, like, is that really everybody, or do they still mean men?
Right. That's well said. I would interpret it as we're still dealing with only the people for whom it is already an obligation. But remember, so that they're talking about the prayers, but if we're mapping the idea of shofar back onto this, women and minors are obligated to hear the shofar, which is a really interesting thing. And it was related to the idea up above that we dealt with tefillin, which is that women and minors are obligated to hear the shofar, even though they cannot fulfill the mitzvah for somebody else. And most importantly, Olivia, even though it is a time-bound commandment. So we've gotten into this weird gray area where it's a positive time-bound commandment both to hear it and to blow it, but the Talmud has decided only to obligate those who have the positive time-bound commandment to fulfill the obligation for other people, which is why we spent a lot of time on the Tosafot a couple pages ago that dealt with the fact that women probably should be allowed not only to blow shofar because they are obligated in the hearing of the positive time-bound commandment, but also all other positive time-bound commandments, right? Tosafot kind of leans in and says, yeah, women should do tefillin too, because that's also a positive time-bound commandment that's obligated on every yachid and yachid. So you have actually, Olivia, you've thrown a hand grenade into my brain, because as I was beginning to read it, I was understanding it probably does mean men, and the more I talked, the more I convinced myself, actually maybe it doesn't mean men, maybe it means women too. And those who don't fall into the standard categories that halakha has laid out of men and women, by the way, because Olivia, you probably know this because you've learned this text, and we mentioned it a number of pages ago, but the other two halachically assigned categories, and then there's two additional categories on top of that of tumtum and androgynous, which are individuals who have less determined, clear genitalia specifically, meaning they are biologically neither male nor female. We don't have specific language that deals with how they would fall out regarding prayer obligation or tefillin or shofar. But the thing that we read a couple pages ago about women would imply that androgynous and tumtum also have potential obligations in this way. I left out the other two categories, one of whom is saris, right? Saris is translated as eunuch. That's a person who originally had all of the biological sexual function of a male, but has the biological sexual function removed for a variety of different issues. There's a sixth category which has gone out of my brain, and I don't remember what it is. Olivia, if you remember, pipe up. But anyhow, so we're into the gray area of gray areas that is furthermore explained by more gray area. Olivia, do you have another comment?
I did. The other categories were people who at birth, it seems like they're female, but like develop traditionally male secondary sex characteristics.
Yeah.
The other way around, which I've also forgotten the names of. But what I really wanted to highlight was some of the Jastro entries for like the roots of the names of these blasts.
Yeah.
Which is integrated with Safaria. If people don't know how beautiful this website is now, if you like click on Tekiah, if you go back up to the Mishnah, it's all there. Or Tokeah, either way, it'll get you there. If you like double click on that word,
there you go. Good job.
It brings this up. And now he gives in the parentheses the root of the word. So 1 period and then in parentheses. Click on that root.
This?
Yes. Nice. So this is the root of the word for tekiah, which means to bring into contact or knock or insert And then he offers that before we get to blasts, it's to drive a peg in or fasten or put up a tent, which is like, you can imagine the sound that takes and the knocking.
Hmm.
So when you're reading a Jasper entry, you're looking for the italics. Those are like the definitions. And so he has a few more if you want to scroll down. No,
Yeah.
you just want to leave? That's fine.
No, sorry, I didn't realize we were going to continue in Tekiah. Yeah, what else?
Well, so then he has to shout or blow a horn. So like a tekiah is like a shout blast, like a slam of blowing that peg in. And I think he has one more underneath if you scroll down farther. Right, and then he just has it in the other languages. But in Aramaic, it also comes to mean clap, which is nice.
Yeah.
It's like this like all-purpose basic sound.
Great. Yeah, the he feel and the nephal are the things that he mentions below, which are just the verbs as they are conjugated in different structures. And a he feel is a causative, right? So like, I am shomea, I hear the shofar. I am mashmia, I cause to be heard. And that's what's called he feel. It can also be the PL. And nephal is basically the passive tense that I am heard if I'm nishma, right? So nitka is I am driven in, right? It is passive. It is passive voice for those of us who have written a letter in Microsoft Word and then been told this was probably a few years ago. It happens less often when you do grammar and spell check. It will sometimes say, there'll be a green squiggly line or anything. It'll say passive voice, right? You've been referring to in passive voice, because in business language they want you to not use passive voice. It's also a very gendered thing. Men tend to use active voice in business settings, and women tend to use passive voice. And there was a whole like kerfuffle 10 or 15 years ago in the New York Times about maybe we need to adjust our business language to be less gendered and yada yada yada. Anyways, now I'm just playing with tensed. All right, are we good? Should we keep going?
I wanted to show you Trua as well. They're all just really nice. And then that word for whimper.
Ah, right. Okay, well, let's take a look at Trua.
So it gives us this like so rua, right? To strike against or shake. It's like it feels like a more violent sound with that striking against. I think I'm bringing this because I think it's interesting to me, at least, like what did things used to sound like? And like still kind of use the same instrument, but how would we describe it now? What were they trying to articulate about these sounds?
Yeah, it's also interesting they use the word to blow a tremolo. Is anybody musical and knows what a tremolo is? Is that like
Yes.
Yeah,
I
what's
used
a tremolo?
to teach. Yeah, a tremolo is a vibration of more than enough vibration on a note.
Right. It is. It seems like it refers to the 9 note da, 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 like it's a little bit right? Yes. No. Maybe. Okay.
I had a comment and a question.
Sure.
Oh, the comment is these definitions, thank you so much for having us go to Jastro, are incredible. That's really what it sounds like, the way they're describing it. It's amazing. The other thing is, the other place where everybody's obligated is reading the Megillah.
Right.
That is an obligation. If you're sick, somebody else, you have to hear it, not read it, but hear the Megillah read. Then you're supposed to go to the person's house and read it to them.
That's right.
Everybody's obligated for that. I mean, it's very interesting.
And Judy, we saw that in the Gemara because they dealt with the question of like a person who blows shofar or reads Megillah out the window of a synagogue and another person is passing by, have they fulfilled?
Right, right.
It's a very
right.
similar.
Yeah, I remember, right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No,
Yeah.
no, you're good. Not everybody was here for every class, so that's appreciated. All right,
No,
Renee, go ahead.
I was here for that class.
Go ahead, Renee.
I may have missed this. I had some family things, but where is the category of the slave? We talked so much about the category of the slave. Does the slave fall into this as far as, because we have learned that the slaves are Jewish also.
Right.
Does it fall into the female, male, and all the other categories, or is it separate?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is we never saw specific language that said women, slaves, and minors are obligated in shofar. But the implication going back a couple pages where it mentions, so when we were learning this a couple weeks ago, it said specifically, like this was like 2 or 3 weeks ago, that children are permitted, we do not prevent children from blowing the shofar. And then they got into the question of, why are they not permitted from blowing shofar? 1. 2, if children aren't prevented, and then it has said something about women also, right? And then the question became like, why does it mention children and then women, but it doesn't mention slaves, even though those are a typical halachic category? So what you're kind of getting into is, what would the halacha do with this law later on, right? How would they address it? And the answer is, to my understanding, based on also the mention up above of Rabbi Gamliel's servant, who may or may not have been a slave, right? The word for servant and the word for slave are the same. They're the word eved. And the question of, right, avadim hayinu, and that translation, avadim hayinu, is slave. But the difference between an eved who is a slave and an eved who is a servant is generally unclear, because you don't know the specific legal obligation of an individual to another individual, right? Did they steal a car and not, have money to pay it back, and therefore they're in the 7-year bound obligation for criminal and civil recompense to an individual, right? Did a guy steal my car and then, sell it for drugs, and then he got caught and he's mowing my lawn and cleaning my house to pay it off? Or did that person fulfill their obligation, enjoy being my personal servant, and become permanently obligated by having their ear nailed to the doorpost of my house with an awl? Or is this person someone who is a compensated servant who is not permanently obligated to me as a servant? We don't really know. But the implication above about Rabban Gamliel is that his servant is handed a shofar to blow it, and therefore has they couldn't possibly blow it if they weren't obligated in blowing. Just like a non-Jew can't blow the shofar for you, a Jew can blow the shofar for you and fulfill your obligation. So Renee, I answered that as best as I could, but you bring up a really great point, which is the typical language of tripling women, slaves, and minors is not used here, and we are left to puzzle why. We will spend the rest of the week puzzling about that, and we'll pick up with the Gemara next week. I hope you guys all had a great Yinzal. You folks all had a great time here today. We will be back next week, same bat time, same bat channel. And we're here in the Lehman Center if you'd like to join us in person. Take care.
Mark, I was out of town